The French Health Minister, François Braun, ending that report from John Lawrenson. Last week, we reported that the International Criminal Court had charged Vladimir Putin with war crimes over his invasion of Ukraine. And it seemed like the final nail in the coffin for Mr. Putin's standing on the world stage. That is, at least in the West. Now, he's got the chance to firm up a valuable alliance in the East, as the Chinese president Xi Jinping makes a 3-day visit to Moscow. He claims to have a plan to end the war. And Mr. Putin says he's reviewed it in detail. But the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has warned that Mr. Xi's proposal could merely be a stalling tactic to help the Russian military.
The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia, supported by China or any other country, to freeze the war on its own terms. Such a move would violate the UN Charter and defy the will of 141 countries who have condemned Russia's war in the United Nations General Assembly.
President Xi said he hoped the Moscow summit would give new momentum to Chinese-Russian relations. As our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg reports, it couldn't come soon enough for Vladimir Putin in the wake of those war crime allegations.
The Chinese leader was welcomed with military honors. Pomp with a purpose. The Kremlin knows it needs China's support more than ever now. Later, Xi and Putin met one-on-one for talks. Xi Jinping called Vladimir Putin his dear friend and a strong leader. The Kremlin leader praised China's economy and promised to discuss Xi's peace initiative for ending the war in Ukraine. There, the public remarks ended. We may never find out what was said in private, but we know Russia would welcome military assistance from Beijing to help it win on the battlefield. So far, though, China has been reluctant to provide lethal aid, fearing secondary sanctions against Chinese companies. We know there is no detailed Chinese peace plan, so progress there seems unlikely. More likely is that in Moscow this week, Presidents Putin and Xi will boost economic cooperation and deepen their strategic partnership, with Beijing playing the role of senior partner. That's because recent events have accelerated Russia's dependency on China. Having burnt bridges with the West, Vladimir Putin has little choice but to look east.
Well, as Steve Rosenberg just mentioned there, China has yet to make public this peace plan it's promised for Ukraine. But officials in Kyiv have urged Xi Jinping to use his influence over Russia and make sure that restoring Ukrainian territory is at the center of his diplomatic efforts. Our correspondent James Landale sent this report from the Ukrainian capital.
Ukraine is playing a cautious game. There's been no criticism of President Xi's visit to Moscow, no anger at the diplomatic boost it's given to Kyiv's sworn enemy. Instead, political leaders here have simply restated the common ground they have with China, namely the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Foreign Ministry spokesman, Oleg Nikolenko, said Ukraine expected Beijing to use its influence on Moscow to put an end to what he called Russia's aggressive war. Privately, Kyiv is lobbying hard for a phone call between President Zelensky and Mr. Xi, something that's yet to happen. Ukraine's fear is that China might give Russia weapons, but it's being patient. Ministers know that however and whenever this war ends, China may be a key player in helping to guarantee the peace and reconstruct Ukraine. So Kyiv is watching and waiting and keeping its diplomatic cards close to its chest.
While Russia hopes to strike a deal for Chinese arms, the European Union has made a new commitment to buy ammunition for Ukraine. The European Defence Agency says 1 million artillery shells will be supplied over the next year, a move that Ukraine has said will be game-changing. Our Europe correspondent Nick Beek reports.
The deal was agreed by defence and foreign ministers from 17 EU countries, as well as Norway. It means they will have to share details of their individual ammunition stockpiles, something that's normally kept secret. But they hope to secure lower prices by placing new joint orders of up to €1 billion. This is new territory for the EU, which emerged after the Second World War as a project to preserve peace, but continues to evolve in light of contemporary Russian aggression. It's unclear whether manufacturers from non-EU countries, such as the UK, will be able to bid for new contracts. Current ammunition production in Europe is said to be lagging behind the levels Ukraine insists it needs, particularly of 155mm artillery shells. Analysts warn it may be many months before the political agreement reached today translates to extra firepower for Kyiv on the front line.
Nick Beek. In the US, 6 people connected to the far-right militia group the Oath Keepers have been convicted of charges relating to the January 6th Capitol riots of 2021. They were among thousands of supporters of Donald Trump who tried to prevent Congress from certifying President Joe Biden's election victory. Nomia Iqbal reports.
The Oath Keepers is a militia group founded in 2009 whose members include current and retired US military personnel, as well as law enforcement officers. There have already been trials involving people connected to the group. In this one, 3 women and 1 man have been found guilty of entering the Capitol that day and obstructing an official proceeding. It carries a punishment of 20 years in prison. 2 others were found guilty of lesser charges. More than 2 years on, the FBI continues to make arrests, and so far prosecutors have brought criminal charges against more than 1,000 people.
Nomia Iqbal. Still to come.
This nepotism, hiring of family members, is something that's deeply ingrained in Afghan society. It didn't start with the Taliban and certainly won't end with the Taliban.
The Taliban issues a ban on appointing relatives to the Afghan government. The International Monetary Fund has approved a $2.9 billion rescue package to help Sri Lanka out of its worst ever economic crisis. And Barasan Ethirajan has the details.
The loan by the IMF offers a lifeline for Sri Lanka that defaulted on its foreign debt almost a year ago as the country plunged into its worst economic crisis since independence from Britain in 1948. Colombo had to take unpopular decisions like sharply raising taxes and fuel prices as part of the conditions to secure the loan. The austerity measures led to strikes in recent weeks. The office of President Ranil Wickremesinghe said the IMF decision would help Sri Lanka to access up to $7 billion in additional funding from other agencies.
Now, in return for that aid package, Colombo has agreed to privatize its national airline and restructure state-owned businesses. Our correspondent, Archana Shukla, spoke to Sri Lanka's foreign minister, Ali Sabri, who led negotiations with the IMF.
But we are looking at primarily is investment and probably on renewable energy, energy security as a regional hub, hospitality trade, which we have not fully realized.
Some of the tougher measures and reforms you've taken, like the tax hikes or the cut in subsidies for fuel and electricity, more such measures are in store going forward to achieve your tough targets?
I think the worst is over. The most of the tough decisions we have already taken, tax hikes. We cannot hike the tax anything more than that, but we can probably expand the tax net. The electricity and the fuel formula is there, so we'll continue with that formula. If the dollar rupee strengthens, if the world price goes down, that benefit should be passed down to the ultimate customer and the consumer. So bad times are relatively over, but tough reforms are still there, and public sector reforms and digitalization are some of our priorities in order to attract investment.
One of the topics during the meetings of the 2 leaders will be the war in Ukraine, as the Russian spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed.
Of course, Ukraine will appear on the agenda. President Putin will provide comprehensive clarification so that President Xi can get a first-hand view of the current situation from the Russian side.
So what can Moscow expect from Xi Jinping's visit? Here's our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg.
Well, I think this is all about symbolism and substance as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned. He's very pleased, I think, that the Chinese leader has come to Moscow for this state visit, hence all the pomp we saw at the airport when Xi Jinping arrived, because then Vladimir Putin can turn around to his domestic audience, to the Russian people, and say, look, we're not isolated. We have one of the world's most powerful leaders, Xi Jinping, on our side, coming to Russia. And that sends a very strong message, I think, to the Russian people. The second thing is, though, of course, Vladimir Putin wants something from this visit. The events of the last year have accelerated Russia's dependency on China, on Chinese markets. So expect to see cooperation agreements, more trade, but also the Russians would quite like more military assistance, I think, from China. So far, Beijing has been reluctant to provide lethal aid to Russia to help Moscow win on the battlefield in Ukraine. A very simple reason why not. China fears that if it does that, that will be crossing a huge red line as far as the West is concerned, America and Europe, and that could trigger secondary sanctions against Chinese companies. And Beijing doesn't want to do that when its main trading partners are the United States and the European Union.
And for domestic audiences in Russia, this visit says, look, we do have friends, but realistically, how isolated is Russia really right now?
Well, if Vladimir Putin was standing here and you asked him that question, he would say, what are you talking about, Jackie? We have lots of friends. He would say, we have China, we have Iran, we have Syria. The reality is that it's a struggle, I think, for the Kremlin now to put together, as someone I spoke to recently described it, a coalition against the West. But, when you listen to him making his speeches, and he made another speech today to delegates from Africa, he considers that he's on a crusade against the West, and he believes he can rally support from parts of the world against America and against Europe.
Well, Vladimir Putin needs allies, of course, and the arrival of the plane from Beijing, as well as the possibility of material support, will prove a boost for him. But what's China getting out of the visit, and how are Chinese media reporting this? A question for our China media analyst, Kerry Allen.
Just before I came to the studio, I was watching the welcome ceremony for Xi Jinping, and the message that's very much coming out in state media is that this is going to be a friendly visit. The word friendly keeps on coming up again and again. Some of the rhetoric that I've heard in state media, a journey of friendship, cooperation and peace, that's how it's being described. And there's really a message that the two countries, China and Russia, are friendly neighbours linked by mountains and rivers. And this message of beginning a new chapter in relations is coming up. So very much an emphasis that this is going to be a happy visit for both countries and the start of something new.
And have the Chinese media had anything to say about the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant that was issued against Mr. Putin on Friday?
They haven't. And what's interesting is on Friday I spoke to Val on the Newsroom programme and said that there was nothing in the media about this, but there were social media discussions about what about the US? What about the US and involvements in countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq? And so what's very notable today is 20 years since the Iraq war. State media are giving a lot of prominence to this and saying that there's still devastation, there's still the impact in Iraq of the US's involvement, and they're really drawing parallels between the US and its involvement in Ukraine. So there's really a feeling in China that if there's a country to be investigated for war crimes, it's the US. And this is the message that a lot of people in China very much feel is the message.
And Mr. Xi's visit is largely going to be about trade. There is going to be a social aspect too, isn't there?
There could be, yes. So the two leaders, Xi Jinping has visited Russia. This will be his 9th time. And they're always known in China as being very friendly meetings. And that's got people talking about what they might do. Obviously, Russia's Putin has this huge table and he's known for keeping a lot of leaders at arm's length. It's very much thought that Xi Jinping and Putin will be very, very close to one another. There are discussions about whether Xi Jinping might visit Moscow Zoo. I mean, one thing that's very notable today is there's a lot of media on two giant pandas at Moscow Zoo known as Rui and Ding Ding. Lots of media on how they're spoilt, rotten. And this is a form of soft diplomacy in China, that you get pandas to very much convey the relations between China and other countries. And so there is this message that's coming through for people that Russia is a caring country. And this is a message that will obviously reach children in the country. So again, very much a feeling this is going to be a positive, friendly meeting between the two leaders.
That was Kerry Allen, and before her we heard from Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Today, March the 20th, marks 20 years since the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. The war toppled the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, but the instability that followed has had catastrophic consequences for the people of Iraq and led to the rise of the group calling itself Islamic State. The fallout of the invasion of Iraq continues to resonate throughout the Middle East and beyond. Our international editor Jeremy Bowen is in Iraq and looks at how the country is still shaped by the decision to invade in 2003.
A lot of the old city of Mosul hasn't been rebuilt yet. It was destroyed in 2017 during the war to eradicate the jihadists of the Caliphate of Islamic State. It was really nasty. House-to-house fighting. And it went on for months. I was here at the time, and a lot of civilians, as well as fighters, were killed. The rise and fall of Islamic State, also known as ISIS, was part of an unfolding catastrophe that engulfed Iraq and was felt right across the Middle East. Now, a lot of it goes back to March 2003. That was when the Americans and the British and their allies invaded Iraq. The Americans called the massive air raids with which they opened the war shock and awe. They claimed, wrongly, that this was the way to make the Middle East safer for everyone. Within weeks, they'd removed the Iraqi dictator, Saddam Hussein. Another false claim was that he had weapons of mass destruction. The US Navy flew President George W. Bush out to an aircraft carrier where he declared victory.
The tyrant has fallen.
It was a frantic and historic weekend for Swiss banking. The country's second largest bank was crumbling. Nervous customers had been yanking their money out of Credit Suisse, and investors were dumping the lender's shares. The Swiss central bank had to do something drastic, so yesterday they got their largest bank, UBS, to buy Credit Suisse for $3.25 billion.
Company's stock traded at a Swiss franc value of $1.86 on Friday and is being acquired in stock by UBS for 76 cents. It's a dramatic haircut to its equity price.
The FT's Arash Massoudi covered the negotiations and said this is probably a new one for Swiss authorities.
No, this is absolutely unprecedented, and it's sort of an unthinkable episode. I mean, if you think about these two banks in the city of Zurich, they literally are headquartered 100 feet away from each other. The rivalry between these two banks has been immense. And Credit Suisse has existed for 167 years. And now it is being subsumed in a panic weekend by its across-the-square rival in the very parochial Swiss kind of, setup of Zurich.
So, Arash, what did Swiss authorities do to broker the deal?
After the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, the Swiss Central Bank stepped in and provided a $54 billion credit line that was designed to basically deal with the heavy levels of outflows that were coming from Credit Suisse. But it was clearly not enough. And not soon thereafter, UBS was instructed to begin working on a takeover.
Yeah, but why would UBS agree to buy Credit Suisse? I mean, Credit Suisse is just riddled with internal troubles. Was UBS just doing Swiss authorities a favor? Do they see any value in this?
So you could take a very long-term view that, one, there is some value here and you made a good deal because you're picking up something that's worth something for very cheap. And two, you're doing a solid for the Swiss government and therefore they're going to further have your back and probably doing a solid for the global financial system. So that would be the sort of bull case from UBS. UBS has been awaiting this phone call from the Swiss regulators and Swiss authorities for months. There was a period in October where there was a panic around the Credit Suisse, and they began basically at that point preparing a playbook for what they would need to do with the inevitable 999 call. Well, that's the equivalent of 911 here in the UK. The 999 calls came in and this week, and they basically had to open that playbook. So that was essentially the situation with UBS.
Is there any concern that the Swiss National Bank overreached, that they went a little too far?
At this point, we need to be honest, which is that it is very likely that Credit Suisse was going to be bankrupt if it opened up this week. the knock-on consequences of that bankruptcy probably would have had seismic impact on the global financial system. And so I think the Swiss would take the view that, and I think that's supported by the US and UK regulators, that they've dealt with this now. They've fended off what could have been a massive, massive scare in the financial system.
And is there any sense of whether this will work to cap the contagion?
It's too early to tell. Last week, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank went down. This week, Credit Suisse required a rescue. So we started in the US, now we're in Switzerland, and we're going to have to watch very carefully to see where it goes from here. But it is too early to make a call if we're out of it. It certainly is not necessarily the mood music I'm hearing.
The Credit Suisse deal means big losses for its shareholders and bondholders. So just hours after the UBS merger was announced, several major central banks came out with a plan to improve U.S. dollar liquidity. It's to guard against additional stress in the markets. The group includes the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and central banks in England, Canada, Japan, and Switzerland. They jointly agreed to make funding available via standing swap lines on a daily basis. Previously, this was done weekly. The central bankers said in a joint statement that the move will ease strains in global funding markets. Let's take a look at the U.S., where the banking troubles all started, first with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, then Signature Bank. We've got First Republic teetering. Anyway, the Biden administration is trying to restore calm. It's also under pressure to expand the U.S. government's guarantee on bank deposits. Currently, it insures up to $250,000. Here's the FT's Joshua Franklin with more.
I don't think you could underplay how big an impact that would have on banking. This would have potentially huge ramifications in terms of how people looked at the safety of banks, but also potentially how banks are run. Not to say that just because deposits are guaranteed, that banks would be, overnight would go into even riskier casinos than some people already look at them as they are. But when you have a government guarantee across all of your deposits, that will certainly have a big impact on how banks are run.
Now, we should be clear that any change is still far off. Right now, it's largely political debate. Who in banking wants this?
So you've got a number of the bank lobby groups who have said that they would support this, especially lobby groups for the smaller and regional banks, which are coming under a lot of pressure with deposit outflows at the moment, because there's been this big flight to quality for the bigger banks that are seen as being safer in the event of a crisis. But the crucial thing to remember is that Biden administration on its own doesn't have the unilateral power to lift the deposit insurance. That actually now requires an act of Congress, and that's because of the Dodd-Frank Act coming out of the last financial crisis.
You mentioned deposit outflows and a flight to quality. That's been another effect of this banking crisis. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, there definitely has been this kind of so-called flight to quality during this period, because you look at the biggest banks, the JP Morgan Chases, the Bank of Americas, the Wells Fargos, they're deemed systemically important to the U.S. economy and to the global economy. So there's this feeling, there's this almost implicit government-backed guarantee of banks like this, because the government just wouldn't allow these banks to fail, is how a lot of customers and a lot of people look at these things. So they feel that you're safe putting your money in there. So you've seen this kind of migration of money, of deposits from the smaller banks to the bigger banks. And that's definitely a trend that a lot of people do feel like is going to continue and exacerbate. And that leads on to this broader question that's about the U.S. market. And in the U.S., you have, around 4,000 banks. And there's this perennial question about whether or not the U.S. actually needs all of these banks. And so this could be a scenario where that question is answered in a pretty meaningful way.
Joshua Franklin is the FT's U.S. banking editor. The past 2 weeks have been a rude awakening for startups.
Well, I spoke to one founder who told me we got our MBA in corporate banking. And I think there's a very clear lesson here that you do not want all of your eggs in one basket.
That's the FT's U.S. banking editor, Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson. He's been speaking to founders about the Silicon Valley Bank collapse.
When the money's flowing, you pay less attention to it. And this is a group of companies for whom the money has been flowing. The venture capital ecosystem has been flush with cash. They've been very eager to deploy it with these exciting new startups. And the exciting new startups have been very focused on other things, namely growth. They've not been thinking very much about risk. And the usual balance in a company that grows more slowly is between that growth appetite and that consciousness of potential risks. And here, the picture we're getting of Silicon Valley and the startups around it is of that balance getting knocked off balance, essentially.
Edge says venture capitalists are now advising the startups they work with on how to manage their cash.
So what we've seen from some of the VC groups, big names like General Catalyst and Greylock, is they're now saying you need to diversify your risk. You need to keep accounts with 2 to 3 separate banks at a time, including one of the big 4 banks like Bank of America, Citi, JP Morgan and Wells Fargo that you know the government is going to stand behind. So it's a very fundamental piece of advice like that we're hearing from the venture capital community now.